Welcome to this week of the course. I trust that you are enjoying your language learning experience and beginning to pick up some new language and understanding of how language acquisition and language learning works. What I want to do here is just focus briefly on this concept of the U-shaped learning curve. You're going to be reading an important article by Kellerman in which he describes his research on this, but because some of the terms used in the article might not be familiar to you, I wanted to give you a brief overview of what he's talking about there so that you can hopefully understand the article with a little more clarity. And so when we talk about the U-shaped learning curve, the big idea here is that learning basically follows a U-shaped pattern. And so when you begin to learn, you're at the top of the U, and actually you start to use language forms that you've learned from your instructor, that you've learned in a textbook, and because they're quite limited, you use them with a great deal of accuracy. So you're at the top of that U. However, as learning progresses and you learn more in your textbook and you start learning more forms in conversation or from your teacher, you actually begin then to experiment with new forms, but you're not actually sure how to use those forms. So your performance starts to drop and you start to go down on this U. You start to make more mistakes. Now, the thing is, making more mistakes in this case or having more errors in your speech is not a sign of failure. It's not a sign that you're not learning. The U-shaped learning curve shows us that it's actually a sign that you are learning. So back here, while your performance might have been quite accurate, you were actually using incomplete language, or you were only using the limited number of forms. As you add more language forms, your performance might decrease. You go towards the bottom until as you start figuring out correct usages and you start figuring out the difference between the different forms and when you should use which form and how exactly that form is structured in the language, then you start to come out of the curve and you move up here to the top. And by the time you get back to here where your performance is once again more accurate and you're making fewer mistakes, that's because you've actually completely learned how to use that new form. You just have more language at your disposal. Now you're going to go back through that U-shaped learning curve again as you add another form. So this is an important concept for you to understand. It relates to two things. First of all, in language acquisition, we talk about what's called stages of acquisition. I don't want to get into that too deeply here because we'll talk about it later in the course. But basically, we know from language research that when children acquire their first language or when second language learners acquire a second language, they actually learn forms in a certain order. And that's because, and I mentioned this in an earlier discussion, our mind is developing what we call an interlanguage. It's like our personal understanding of how a grammar works. And that understanding is cohesive, it makes sense, and it's growing. And so, for example, children, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but a 6 or 7-year-old will often, they'll start to use correct forms like made, for example, the past made. It's an irregular past form, right, in English? But then they start to figure out, they start to learn, oh, the way I actually turn a word into the past is to add ed onto it. Well, at first they said made because they heard people saying that. They start learning the form, add ed, then they stop saying made and they'll start saying maked, right? Well, it looks like they're digressing in their language learning, but what's actually happening is that they're growing in their language learning because they're learning this new form. Eventually, then, they come back to the top of the U and they figure out, oh, there's an irregular form, made, and I shouldn't use maked in this situation. Now they're back to correct usage. And so there's a lot of study that's been done on how even in first language learning, second language learning, we progress through stages of acquiring those things. And those stages kind of relate to this concept of the U-shaped learning curve. Now, the second implication that I want you all to wrestle with this week is what this means for language assessment. And so you've gone through 3 weeks of formal language study. You had an assessment in week 1, 2, 3, and I don't know what you're seeing there, if you're seeing growth or you're not seeing growth. And what I want to throw out to you is that the U-shaped learning curve may explain why you might not be seeing growth, why you may, in your scores anyway, there may be growth happening, but your usages may become less accurate, or your scores on the test may not be going in the right direction. And so when we think about the U-shaped learning curve and we think about assessment in language learning, we need to understand that it's possible that you could actually see a digression in terms of your scores, but that digression may be representative of actual language growth because your mind, this interlanguage that you're developing, is trying to put the pieces together, and it just requires time. That's why we want to encourage you to continue beyond formal language learning, to continue learning so that your mind continues to put together the pieces so that you can go out of that trough, you can go into that final stage of learning. I hope you'll find this article engaging and discussion helpful as you process your experience over the last few weeks of this course. Thank you so much.